Two men who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to dangle. In 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing spider talk, the amazing spider talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the amazing spider talk.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I'm the founder and editor of SuperiorSpiderTalk.com.
And I'm mischievous Mark Giannacchio, founder of Chasing Amazing blog and the author of 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for our 12th and final episode of the season of all new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoy this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture.
It's the final episode, Dana. It's a little sad and bittersweet.
Yeah, but, we'll be back before everybody realizes they missed us.
There you go. Well, as we've been talking about all season long on the all-new Amazing Spider Talk, we've been taking a closer look at the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko creative run on Amazing Spider-Man. In our most recent episode, we talked about how important the mystery element in Spider-Man comics is, especially as it relates to the Green Goblin and other goblins. There were a lot of goblins. But today, we're going to fittingly bring the whole thing to a close by discussing the overall big picture legacy of the Lee Ditko run. I guess the question, Dan, is this the best run ever or the greatest run ever? Clearly, we have no bias.
Absolutely none. We've given two very easily delineated options, best and greatest. So like Mark said, we're bringing it all to a close. So we're going to be talking about the entire Steve Ditko and Stan Lee run on the book, which you can find just about anywhere, be it the Marvel Unlimited app or at your local comic book store or even your local library. Which you should definitely be going to. I know I do. And yeah, you can get it pretty much wherever comics are sold. So I guess if after all of this, you haven't read it yet, you've listened to this whole season and you're like, I still don't really know what they're talking about. Why not do yourself a favor and check it out? It's 40 issues. That's Amazing Spider-Man 1 to 38 and the 2 annuals. So check it out. So that being said, now on to our episode titled Best Run or Greatest Run?
What do you think about Spider-Man caught on? Do you think it was really just the I can relate to this guy aspect of it?
I think there were a lot of reasons. I think perhaps the main reason was the I can relate to him. Because he was shy. He wasn't that successful with girls. He had to worry about his family. I think most teenagers reading it thought to themselves, hey, that could be me, So there certainly was that identification.
Right.
But beyond that, I must say truthfully, I think Steve and I came up with some great stories and some great villains.
Right.
Doc Ock, Green Goblin, the Sandman, and everything worked. And visually, the story was
character
great,
too.
because the way Steve would have him crawling on walls and swinging on webs, and it just... everything came together perfectly.
I guess before we really get into the thick of this very important debate between best and greatest, I know obviously in terms of you and your fandom, this was a very influential run, and it seems as if you kind of expressed that to somebody related to this run recently. And, well, what happened?
Oh, we're going to get right into this right away?
Well, it's the first note on the page, so I thought we would.
Yeah, if people follow me on Facebook, I actually wrote a letter to Steve Ditko about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. And, you send these things, handwritten letter expressing how much, his work meant to me. The first time I picked up issue 12, the Electro issue, the first Ditko I ever read, and one of the first Spider-Man comics I ever read, and how much it meant to me. I think it was really, issue 375 was my first issue, but you can't really get a great sense of Spider-Man just from that issue. It's kind of an odd one-off battle issue. But reading the Electro issue really introduced me to Peter Parker and his world, and I think you could say that about most of the issues from this run, right? They all really round the bases of covering everything you need to know about Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and that Electro issue is great, the whole J. Jonah Jameson mix-up thing. So yeah, I wrote to Steve, and you don't really expect to hear back. Well, you especially don't expect to hear back from Steve Ditko.
Right.
But I did. 5 days later from New York, I got this letter in the mail, and my wife came running up the stairs to our apartment, burst through the door in a thing of energy and ran over, and she was like, "You would not believe what just came in the mail." And dumb me had already forgotten that I had sent this letter. I'm like, "What is it? I have no idea." And she's like, "It's Steve Ditko," which, first of all, I have to express a certain level of excitement that my wife got excited about a letter from Steve Ditko. I'm clearly winning in that regard. So yeah, Steve wrote me back this really nice letter. Well, very Steve Ditko-y letter. He just addressed all of my questions. I asked him, since your books inspired me so much, were there books that inspired you? Nick Caputo, when he was a guest on our show, expressed that Steve Ditko was a real champion of the comics medium when he was working on the books. So I was curious, what was he reading that really sold this medium to him? He's an illustrator. He probably could have gone all kinds of different directions in his career. And the quote-unquote response goes something like this: "I never kept any kind of record of what, quote, inspired me, end quote, or directed me to one area or another. The one thing in doing comic books is that the past work is irrelevant. As a freelancer, my focus is on what's next. Regards, Steve Ditko." So there you go.
A very unsurprising response.
But I have a Steve Ditko letter with his signature on it, and amazing that he writes back to all these fans that write to him. He certainly didn't have to respond. So thank you, Steve Ditko. I'm sure you're not listening to this. 100% sure you're not listening to this, but I'm going to put it out into the ether. Thank you for the wonderful letter. And what a great way to cap off this whole season with getting a letter from Steve Ditko.
Good job, Dan. And it goes to show that you just went ahead and did it. I probably should have just done that when I was writing the book. I know he doesn't give interviews, but I could have used something from a letter probably, but alas.
Well, some of us go the extra mile, Mark.
Well, it's like that whole thing. Ask a question, you get an answer,
I have no right to make fun of you. You wrote a whole book.
But you have a Ditko.
I do. Now I get to hold that over you in my collection. Forget the annuals. You don't even have a Ditko letter.
Oh, my God. Okay.
But I thought, what a great way to like end this season off. That with something like that. I hope we can make all of these seasons kind of special in a way like that. I think if we could get at least Steve Ditko had a word on this podcast. Stan Lee didn't, but who'd have thought our best connection will be with Steve Ditko?
There you go. So Dan, in your kind of setup to the letter, you rose an interesting point about, obviously your first comic on Spider-Man was 375, which was most discernibly not a Steve Ditko or Stan Lee issue. And then you eventually came around to reading some Lee and Ditko with the Electro issue. But I'm just kind of curious, were you kind of sold on what they were doing, or what they did, I should say, with the character from Jump Street? Or, was it something that you kind of came to appreciate more as you got a little more into comics and the medium and the character? I'm just kind of curious where you fall on that, because I know where I do.
Yeah, immediately I attached to what Lee and Ditko were doing. But I think my viewpoint of it is it's very specific, because I got that Electro issue, and it was a reprint like a week or two after I got my first issue of Spider-Man. So it was probably the second issue I ever read, and I think that's a pretty strong issue to understand the formula of Spider-Man. And then like a month later, my father bought me the Best of Spider-Man, I think the second volume, and it had Amazing Fantasy 15 and the Master Planner in it as the representation, as a representative of the Ditko run. And those are like two of the best comics ever made ever. So like I entered Ditko with a very, seeing the very best of it. And who could say no to that?
Yeah, it's just funny because, I came to the character and to Lee and Ditko on a completely different level. Obviously I've talked about this ad nauseum over the years. My first issues of Spider-Man were the Michelini-McFarlane run. And, even some of the first older issues, Silver Age issues that I purchased were like Lee, John Romita Sr. issues. I didn't even really look at a Lee Ditko issue until I was maybe about 14 or 15. So I've been reading comics at that point for a good 6 or 7 years. And I got a very well-read copy of Amazing Spider-Man number 25, the Spider Slayer debut. And I'm not going to lie. I was just kind of flummoxed by the whole Lee and Ditko thing. I was like, it didn't seem, I don't know. I didn't quite get it. You know what I mean? Like it just seemed odd to me. The art seemed odd. I was so used to that kind of larger than life, very superhero-esque art of McFarlane and Larson, and later, and then going back Romita. So seeing Ditko's art kind of confused me. And as a result, I can admit on this podcast here that I didn't really come to appreciate those comics in this run, especially until I was probably even in my 20s. It just took time. And maybe 5 or 6 years ago, if someone had asked me the question to pick between Ditko and Romita, who will be the subject of our next season, spoiler alert, I probably would, I would have without blinking said Romita. And I think I still favor Romita to this day, but it's a much harder choice because I feel like the further and further and further I become ingrained with this character and what he is, the more I've come to appreciate just the magic that these two did on these issues and with this character.
I would probably have said the same thing. I would probably have gone with Romita. And I was thinking, when I went to meet Stan Lee for the first time and get him to sign one of my books, I had, issue 33 and issue 50. And I chose issue 50 for him to sign because both are favorite issues of mine. And I think probably as a kid, I really connected with 50, although the kind of super heroics are more fun in 33. There's just more of it. But I chose 50 because I felt like that was more indicative of Stan Lee's actual writing, because whether I knew it or not at the time, like, there was something so Steve Ditko driven about 33. And even just doing this show, I have really come to appreciate the Ditko stuff even more than I already did. But I think I was fortunate that my really first introduction to the character was weirdly through Ditko and those books. Not that the Ditko run was really easily available at the time. It's not. Today you can get it, digitally in the Essentials collections and stuff. And in the early 90s, there wasn't quite the easy access to the whole run as a thing. So it was kind of like, it wasn't even the art style that attracted me to it, I don't think, as a kid. It was more like being able to understand the origins of these characters that I really liked was a big draw. And now it's kind of become everything,
Right. Yeah. Once you kind of understand how everything is ultimately derived from these issues, you kind of grow to really love and cherish them. At least that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, and it makes it hard to really make that determination. Is it the best or greatest, or is it even the best Spider-Man run? Because you can't really discuss any other run without the context of Lee and Ditko's run, because it is the run that created the character. How do you compare anything to that? Right. Like, it's forever going to be the run that created Spider-Man. And
Right.
And I guess, as we've discussed, all the stories told here really have become indicative of the framework for how we think about the character, which I guess really illustrates its long-lasting power.
Right. Well, I mean, putting aside how it stacks up against other runs of Spider-Man, in terms of, the big picture, comic books, superhero comic books especially, I know that, there are plenty of non-superhero books out there that people love and adore and probably could stake a claim as the best ever in terms of a run on comics. But, we're in the superhero business, so I'm not really interested in comparing those apples and oranges right now. But, I would say in terms of comparison, the most fitting comparisons, obviously a contemporary of Lee and Ditko was the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby run on Fantastic Four, which lasted, I think, at least 100 issues in the 60s until Kirby. I mean, it was really the last book that Kirby stayed on until he left Marvel. Then, of course, there's the Chris Claremont, John Byrne run on Uncanny X-Men, which started in the late 70s. And I think that went into the early 80s. And that run is known, of course, for stories like Days of Future Past, the Dark Phoenix saga. There was just a bunch of other really well done one-offs and two-parters in that run of stories that fans have beloved. It's pretty much everything in X-Men media in terms of movies came from those comics. And then another Marvel book that gets mentioned a lot in terms of best ever for superheroes is the Frank Miller, Klaus Janson run on Daredevil, which kind of set the standard for kind of dark modern comics. So you almost kind of have to. It's almost in its own league from what Spider-Man or Fantastic Four, X-Men is, because it really is its own flavor of storytelling. But all the same, because of how groundbreaking it is considered one of the best runs ever in comics. And then just like a last one I'd probably throw out there in terms of superhero comics that gets quoted a lot is the Marv Wolfman, George Perez run on Teen Titans in the 80s. That's also kind of contemporary to the Claremont Byrne X-Men. So again, you kind of have to, like, you almost have to view those two through the same prism. And I don't know if it applies to Spider-Man per se, or like Fantastic Four. You know, Dan, I know you haven't read all of these. I've read most of these, but not all of them. But you know, it is interesting to kind of put this up there, because I do think that as much as we do love The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko, I mean, there are some pros and some cons that you probably need to measure against it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't read. I've read the Daredevil run you mentioned. I'm reading Lee and Kirby's Fantastic Four right now. But my big thing that I think I would lay at the feet of Lee and Ditko's Amazing Spider-Man is, I don't know that Marvel would exist in the way that it does without this run of comics. The Peter Parker formula, the troubled everyman superhero, is essentially Marvel's calling card. You know, maybe not everybody is an everyman. You know, Thor and Iron Man certainly aren't. You know, but Peter Parker like perfected this in this run, and I think most of their identity is built around this kind of the world right outside your window thing that I don't think Kirby's Fantastic Four was really doing. It was so fantastical. Even though it existed in New York, all of the villains in the first, I mean, well, like almost the whole run are these Galactus, larger-than-life mole people.
Well, I mean, that's kind of actually, you know, as much as Spider-Man kind of centered on the friendly neighborhood aspect of Marvel, which was a very distinct Marvel thing. I mean, Fantastic Four was the book that kind of pushed the boundaries of what superhero comics could be. So I guess it kind of comes down to what your preference is. I mean, do you want these far out cosmic bending stories? If that's it, you're probably going to say, well, Lee Kirby, Fantastic Four. But if you're someone who identifies more with like the personal struggle of a hero, you're going to go Spider-Man with Lee Ditko.
Yeah, and maybe I'm showing my colors, is that I've never really been into like Marvel's Galactic side. You know, I read it all, but it doesn't connect for me in the way that a Daredevil or a Spider-Man does, because, I mean, for all the obvious reasons that they're like people like me in some regard.
I'm with you on that. I'm just saying, like, in terms of where things are coming from. I mean, like Lee, the Fantastic Four run kind of, it really, you're looking at two different Marvel templates, but they're templates all the same that have been kind of done over and over again. I mean, in terms of the Spider-Man, Lee Ditko Spider-Man template and the Lee Kirby Fantastic Four template, it's probably, of all the options I threw out there, the most appropriate in terms of comparison, because you really are looking at contemporaries and two very different ideas, and what can be accomplished with those ideas and what can be built out of those ideas. I don't think the stories are any better or worse. I mean, Galactus trilogy is I love the Galactus trilogy in terms of Fantastic Four comics, but you know, I can't say it's any better than the Master Planner trilogy in terms of really intense storytelling. In fact, I would probably go with Master Planner because it's more personal. It's a more personal struggle, and I like that more.
I know the whole family element of the Fantastic Four was very unique to it, but you don't find those stories to be somewhat similar to what the competition was doing? This kind of, you know, like Superman, these larger-than-life stories. Like, to me, Spider-Man just stands out as this real anomaly in that era.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, but like there was just something discernibly different in terms of like the far outness of Fantastic Four, because like my sense was, looking back at like old Justice Leagues and Supermans and stuff, you know, it would be like, oh, here's an alien from space and, you know, he's here to do stuff. You know what I mean? Like,
so basically like early Thor and early Incredible Hulk issues.
Exactly. Whereas Fantastic Four, like, it kind of really pushed the boundaries of, like, there is a universe beyond this that it's just as important as the universe on Earth. You know, like Galactus is, you know, he's basically an element. You know what I mean? Like he's some, you know, and like ditto with, like, the fact that he has this herald, the Silver Surfer, that like is spotting out galaxies for their resources to be drained and stuff like that. It's very, really like deep, heavy cosmic stuff going on in those books, you know. And then, like, you know, they would follow that up with like the really great one-off issue with the Thing, this man, this monster, and it's like, you know, that's kind of like their, you know, the 1-2 punch of, okay, well, we told this really far out galactic story, now we're going to tell a very personal story about the Thing and his relationship with everyone on the team. And that was kind of the majesty of it. And of course, the other thing with Fantastic Four, and I think this is one of the general overall demerits against Lee Ditko, and I think some of our readers kind of wrote in about this, was, you know, Lee Kirby, Fantastic Four went on for over 100 issues. Lee Ditko, Spider-Man, only went on for about, you know, with the annuals, about 40-something issues. It feels very short and abbreviated, and there's a discernible cutoff point on Lee Ditko after Master Planner. You could tell Ditko had checked out at that.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, like Master Planner just feels like this like perfect encapsulation. They finally figured it out. This is like the best comics they're ever gonna get, and then it's just like done. Like that's might as well end the run there,
right?
At that high point,
right? But you know, just some other pluses, I would say, in the Lee Ditko camp. I mean, you know, we obviously talked about this at length in one of our episodes earlier this season, but I mean, we can't say it enough. The Rogues Gallery that they put forward. I mean, like, okay, you could maybe say Batman's got better villains, but, you know, Bill Finger and Bob Kane weren't out there creating all of these villains in rapid succession the way Lee and Ditko were on Spider-Man. You know, like, I mean, in during Spider-Man, they pumped out one after the other: Vulture, Sandman, Doc Ock, Electro, Mysterio, Craven, Green Goblin. Yeah, Chameleon. I mean, like, it's you know, basically all of the major, certainly all the major Spider-Man villains, and at least a half dozen top tier Marvel villains all getting pumped out in the span of a couple of years. I mean, it's unheard of. You know, even, you know, again, even these other runs that we're talking about, I mean, on X-Men, I mean, you know, they were still using Magneto and still, you know what I mean? Like, this isn't like, you know, like X-Men, they were playing around with the timeline with Days of Future Past, and okay, well, we're gonna take the Phoenix, we're gonna take Jean Grey, who had become the Phoenix early, you know, a couple of years earlier, and now we're gonna make her the Dark Phoenix, you know, so she's evil now. And it's like, okay, I mean, we've kind of dealt with heroes going rogue. That wasn't completely unheard of at that point, but you know, these are all on Lee Ditko, wholly original villains with their own personalities, their own quirks, their own origin stories. Some more elaborate than others, and in the same vein, the supporting cast is unparalleled on Spider-Man. I mean, you know, you have Aunt May and Jameson and Flash and Betty Brant and you know, all of these very different, distinct characters with their own personalities, their own quirks. No other comic book series, I really think, can claim that. I mean, Fantastic Four has Doctor Doom, and then the Mole Man.
And even Doctor Doom takes a long time to really establish himself as an interesting character. I mean, his first story is sending the Fantastic Four back to find Blackbeard's treasure.
Right.
Although that's probably about as equally goofy as the Green Goblin's first story.
Right. But
and both have the same kind of mystery angle. Who's the guy behind the mask? You know,
right.
That kind of thing. But yeah, your point is made. The Fantastic Four's villains, you know, there's some great ones, but I don't think anybody figured out their formula as quickly as Spider-Man did. You've got some missteps like the Tinkerer early on, but the first issue, you got this great thing with Jameson and the Rocket. By issue 3, you've got Dr. Octopus. In like early Hulk and Thor and Fantastic Four, they're fighting people that you would never hear from ever again for like a dozen issues. Spider-Man was already 100% committed to the world that it had created.
Absolutely. And then, the other thing you gotta put in Spider-Man's camp, and again, we talked about this at length in a couple episodes, is the origin story. I mean, it's probably the second most famous origin in comics, and I would only say second most is because we've seen Martha Wayne and her pearls and the gunshots in Gotham's Alley more than we've seen Uncle Ben get killed.
It's funny you say that, because I had a friend message me the other day like, hey, did I miss something? Or why didn't he get bit by a spider in Spider-Man Homecoming? And my response was, because you know about that. You just told me the story.
Right, exactly.
You don't need it anymore.
Right.
And I'm thankful that we got to see the pearls again in Batman v Superman. I think half the audience was like ready to chew off their own arm.
Right. But I mean, and even beyond the fame of the origin and of poor Uncle Ben, I mean, it's just, we talked about this when we were talking about the remixes of the origin. It's such a well done origin story. It's people who've tried to redo it have either failed or just acknowledged, I can't change it, so let me just do my own thing. Like it's perfect. It's a perfect. There's very little in comics I would call perfect, but Amazing Fantasy 15 I would call perfect, right?
I would agree. Our only A+ grade we've ever given to a comic.
So I mean, we've talked about like the Everyman fact, and we've talked about kind of its influence on other Spider-Man media. I mean, this is the run. More often than not, in the animated series and movies, whatever, it's going to get referenced. I mean, but again, does that make it the greatest or the best? I don't know. I mean, are there other runs of Spider-Man that you like more?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. You said, are there runs that I like more? I think there are runs that represent the character in a way that I fundamentally like more, or it has more emotion, or I'm more excited about it. Like I would say Stern's run, JMS's run for the most part, even Slott Superior I think is more like viscerally exciting. Like much of Bendis's Ultimate run, like these are things I'd reread more often than I reread Ditko's stuff. I don't know if they would be better. They're all really reliant on Ditko and that formula and having 20/20 hindsight to do something unique. But I think one of the things that sets all of those stories that I just set aside and makes them good or better than average in terms of Spider-Man, or maybe something I like more than Ditko, is that while they're contingent on the first run's creations and ideas, they largely avoid the villains created by Ditko and Lee and come up with new scenarios. Like Stern had all new villains and Black Cat and the Hobgoblin, even though that mystery was very similar. And like JMS, like asked you to completely rethink the origin while not really delving into it too much, the actual origin. And, we've talked about Slott Superior to death, but, there's nothing really Ditko about that other than Otto being present. How about you? Is this your number one Spider-Man run?
It's a hard question because it's like you acknowledged, it's hard to. You don't want to like completely dismiss it, or I shouldn't say dismiss it, but like it's responsible for so much. Like you're just kind of like, you don't want to be there and make it sound like, oh well, there are still some flaws in it, blah blah blah. I mean, at the end of the day, like runs of Spider-Man I like more. I mean, like you mentioned, the Stern, I like in terms of just overall pure joy reading and things that I've reread. I'm not that I don't reread these Lee Ditko issues a lot, but like the Stern run, I and the Stern Romito run, I just adore. The DeFalco Friends run, I just adore. Yeah, I mean, even the Lee Romito run, I adore. But again, there's some element to that where it's like, there's some parts of it that are great, but then there are some parts that are not so great, and a lot of it is kind of owed up to its influence, I think, more than its actual quality. Ultimate, like those first, like 50 or 60 issues of Ultimate. I mean, that's like some of the best comics ever read. They're a joy. I would read them over and over and over and over again. It's just, although that might be a case where it's almost like, did it go on too long? The Bendis Bagley run.
Never. It just had a couple bad stories. Right.
But I mean, at the end of the day, it's also like something that I would probably put up there. So, I mean, the things that kind of work against Lee and Ditko. I mean, we mentioned the duration of it. I think it's too short, and kind of it just feels like it ends abruptly. Like you said, like the story actually really ended in 33 with Master Planner, and then it was like, oh, but we're going to keep going, and you could tell it was just like, oh, let's keep going now. And I mean, there are certain comics, although I would say Spider-Man less so than a lot of other Marvel comics of this time, but there are still issues that suffered from that kind of, hokey Stan Lee-isms that a lot of the comics had at that time.
As made fun of in that special Deadpool issue. Exactly.
Ditko as brilliant as he was as both an artist and a plotter. I mean, like I would say there are other artists I still like, just pure eye test I like more. I mean, I think like Kirby has more polish and his characters I think are more memorable and marketable for lack of a better word. But then also like, other artists like Romita, George Perez, John Byrne. I mean, these are like, the artwork there is just like unparalleled in terms of the dynamic nature of it.
Right. Well, how often do you see Ditko's drawings on backpacks and baseball caps and things like that? I even have several students that have John Romita Sr. artwork on their, Spider-Man book bags and stuff, and it's like, I've never seen a Ditko book bag. No. And then like, in terms of individual stories, we talk about Master Planner a lot. We talk about the origin story a lot, but like, there's not a lot of individual stories from Lee Ditko that I feel like have kind of lasted the test of time. I mean, we like the Goblin Crime Master story, but I think outside of like hardcore Spider-Man fans, I don't think a lot of people talk about that story. Yeah, people talk about Kraven's Last Hunt and all those things.
Or the Hobgoblin or Superior Spider-Man or, like those are the stories that have had this like lasting impact. And,
But Master Planner shows up in like every Spider-Man movie ever. Every time he lifts something, they're like, oh, Master Planner. To the point that it like happened in Homecoming. And I'm like, I'm really glad they did this, but we also saw this in Spider-Man 2 and yada, 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 yada.
Yeah. So that's kind of, not that we're really coming to a scientific conclusion here, but I mean, I when people criticize it or just don't go all in the way we are kind of going in here, I think that's where those arguments are coming from. But, we're biased, so
yeah. I mean, I would put my money on it being like one of the most influential runs of comics ever. I think it created a whole new avenue of pop culture and a new character archetype in the medium that would go on to largely define superhero comics like on the whole, and I think, yeah, you're right. The Fantastic Four is a good kind of counterpart to that, and DC's got their own thing. But I think there are so many books that are trying to be Spider-Man. Make no mistake, this incredibly bizarrely costumed character that's a spider character is Marvel's flagship character. There's just something about it that connects beyond all of the obvious detractors that anybody looking at it on the surface would see.
Right. Well, Dan, you and I, we kind of put it out there to our listeners to give us some feedback, and why don't we go over some of the responses we got? The first two here, I believe these were both Twitter responses. This is from longtime listener Dennis Mercer, who mentioned that he believes Lee Ditko is the greatest Spider-Man run. Without it, nothing exists. They built up so much mythology and classic characters in a relatively short time, and pop culture would not be the same without these issues. That kind of echoes a lot of what we've been saying. And another comment that kind of echoes us is from Gonza, and he wrote, from Lee Ditko Spidey to present, almost every comic book tells a Peter story, an average person with the same problems and moral dilemmas as us. We love drama. Maybe it's not a surprise that a romance comics artist took Ditko's place. That's referring to Ramita, and that's an interesting point. It's kind of like, we always think of kind of Ramita coming in to kind of put out the fire of Ditko quitting, but, I mean, there definitely was a calculation to it as well.
Absolutely. We got another message from Levi Hunt, who is a contributor to my site, and Levi writes, it's possibly the most important, also the Fantastic Four run, but it's not the best Marvel run, and he says Claremont's X-Men fills that role, or even the best Spider-Man run, and he says he prefers Romita with Lee and Romita Jr. with Stern and Bendis and Bagley. But he says, influential, important, and foundational don't trump emotional for me in terms of best reads. Those few other runs I mentioned are more fun, more thrilling, and more heartfelt for me. Ditko Lee is up there, but Ditko checking out after My Destiny and then leaving shortly after is like if Jack left after a Galactus trilogy. Feels like it just ended as it was becoming great. So I think Levi echoes a lot of our sentiments. Similarly, Thomas Metz also wrote to us and said, it's one of the best, but I would rate Claremont Burns' X-Men higher. Proteus, Wolverine vs. the Hellfire Club, Magneto's Volcano Base, and the two better-known stories, which we already mentioned. And then also similar to that, Kevin Ewing, a longtime listener, wrote into us saying, I really enjoyed the format of the show in the first season covering the Lee Ditko era. I hold their run in a very high regard, and it still holds up for me after recently rereading it back in 2016. But the best superhero comic run in history, it is certainly up there, but I'd have to give the top spot to Claremont's X-Men run and the Claremont-Byrne collaboration specifically. Lee Ditko would get my vote for top Spidey run of all time, edging out Lee Romita, Stern, JMD, and Slott runs. Yes, Slott, please don't hate me. So it looks like Kevin is echoing this kind of Claremont support. Lots of love for the Claremont run.
Yeah, I mean, it's when like sites like Comics Should Be Good, which I know is just all part of CBR now, but it's still Comics Should Be Good to me. Whenever they do like their top reader lists, Claremont Byrne X-Men always kind of comes up top, and I get where it's coming from, and I think on a very kind of parochial level, I don't disagree with it. I'm not going to lie. Personally, there's something about Claremont's writing that leaves me a little cold. But those stories are those stories. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, they took these characters that, I mean, well, frankly, the X-Men at that point, the team was pretty brand new. But even beyond that, the X-Men as a concept, not that they were a failure, but they were not popular, and they turned them into the most popular thing in the world. I mean,
yeah.
So it's there's something to be said about that. I mean, like they turned Wolverine into a household name. I mean, it's so like, again, it kind of comes down to, well, is it because it's the best or because it's the most influential? I think because it's newer, people may not they may not be seeing the forest from the trees there the way they are with Lee Ditko. I mean, we kind of take for granted that, well, clearly it's influential. It was the first, whereas Claremont and Byrne, they came on to the X-Men 20 years later. But the fact of the matter is it was basically a whole new book by the time they came on it. It was a completely different concept. Does that make it the best? I don't know. I mean, like, they built up Wolverine the way Lee and Ditko built up Spider-Man, but of course they also built up Colossus and Cyclops, and well, Cyclops had been created, but Nightcrawler and Storm. So I mean, they had a little more to play with, and the fact that it was a team book and they built so much mythology within this team is kind of impressive in its own right. So,
very good argument. All right, who else will we hear from?
Well, of course, we have a friend of the pod, Bob Batchelor, who, fresh off his Stan Lee book, he wrote, established an unknown character into arguably the most iconic superhero of all time. It made heroes human. Agree with that. Matt here wrote, I found the episodes discussing Stan Lee and Steve Ditko especially fascinating as they shattered my impressions of both creators and really made me realize that Spider-Man wasn't a grand plan. It was created at Marvel offices and could have never really caught on at all. Having grown up with Spider-Man, I knew this, but your discussion made me realize it in a more crystallized way that I could put words and ideas to. So look at us. Having an influence, Dan. Maybe we're the most influential.
That sounds like a good place to end the conversation. No. I mean, coming down to it, at the end of the day, like, it's hard for me to say this is like the best or the greatest run of comics of all time. Probably because I'm not reading it as it came out, but it is. It means so much to me, and it's been a real blast to discuss it in pretty minute detail with you. I'm sure we could have done this for another 20 episodes, but I felt like we really got really deep into this.
I think you wanted to do another 20 episodes, and you can blame me for making it only 12.
Now that we've done 12, I'm glad we only did 12.
I just still remember when we were first planning this out, I was like, you were like, we should do individual episodes on Aunt May and Jameson and Betty Brand. And not Betty Brand. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit.
Well, Mark, I'll let you have the last word on that.
No. I'm glad that we got to talk about this, Dan. I mean, this is we started the show, oh God, almost 5 years ago now.
Quote, Mark, this is a quote from Mark. If I'm still doing this in 5 years, I won't know what to do with myself.
There we go. But the fact of the matter is, we never got to kind of do the show this way until we decided, hey, it's our show. We're not married to anything. Let's do it different. And I'm glad. I mean, this change, I feel, at least for us, I feel it's reinvigorated some things. But, it's also not for nothing given me yet another new appreciation for the work of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. I mean, I definitely, as I wrote Chasing Amazing and Superior Spider Talk and then wrote the book, you definitely kind of get this appreciation of it. I was neck deep in it during the book. So, I don't even know if it was appreciation as much as just total immersion and osmosis. But I definitely would say that doing this season on the podcast, it's like, beyond just being able to get to reread these stories again that I love so much, it's just kind of viewing the intricacies of it and having the folks and the guests that we had on talk about it from their perspective. I think it just really sealed my appreciation for the work that they did.
Yeah, Mark, this was a really awesome experience. And I also just want to say thank you to you, the listener, for joining us on this journey. If you're listening to this, it's the end of the season. Congratulations. You made it. You made it to our final episode. And we've loved having you. Whether you've been quietly listening or writing to us, it's great to know that you're out there listening and joining us for this journey.
Yes, thanks to everyone, of course, who tuned in on this, our final episode of an all-new Amazing Spider Talk. But Dan, we're not going away quietly into the night. This is not a one-season episode series. We're not freaks and geeks of the podcast world. There's more to come. We're going to be taking a little bit of a break for the next month or so, give or take. Although we will also be having some special episodes in between because, we never can totally disappear. But in terms of this thematic season-esque type content, we will be doing something for season 2. And Dan, what is that going to be?
Yeah, as you said, Mark, sadly, we need to have some time to do some research for the next season, to pull all the episodes together and book some fabulous guests. But our next season, and you kind of let the cat out of the bag, even though it's probably fairly obvious, but our next season is going to be called Big Time. I know we're not talking about Dan Slott's Big Time. We're talking about Spider-Man's Big Time, his explosion into pop culture with the Lee and John Romita Sr. run on the book, the hugely successful run that had all these ripple effects into every element of culture, be it television shows, action figures, costumes. The world was introduced to Spider-Man in a huge way, and we're going to cover it in our next season.
Absolutely. So we wouldn't have been able to do this season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk without our Patreon subscribers. Plug. So thank you all so much for the help in keeping us funded and working hard through the hours of research and editing that go into the show. As a thank you, we'll be continuing to podcast on our Patreon feed throughout the break. And we've got some great episodes planned, Dan. Like what?
Well, last week, you and we reviewed Amazing Spider-Man 791 and closed out that Fall of Parker storyline. But we'll be continuing. We're going to cover the Venom Inc. story that's going on as well. We're going to talk about Venom Inc. Alpha this week. But we also want to talk about all kinds of other new stuff, like that new Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse trailer that just dropped, our favorite Spider-Man video games with a special guest, and our favorite Spider-Man Christmas issue of all time that has been a big thing going back between Mark and I for years. And I also just wanted to say that I get messages from our listeners all the time. Some people have loved this new change for the show, and other people have expressed to me how much you miss the old monthly review episodes of the show. And I just really want to remind you that you can have it all. You can have your cake, eat it too, and take that whole cake debacle to the Supreme Court if you really want to. For just $3.99 a month, that's the price of a new comic a month, or even less than the price of a new comic if you're talking about Venom Inc. Alpha, which was $4.99. I just wanted to say. And yeah, that's just one more comic. That's the price of one more comic for all the podcasts that you love that Mark and I do. So if you're really desiring that, it's theirs for yours to get for a really low price.
Yeah, don't forget, Dan, we got an issue 800 coming up at some point. I'm sure that's going to be like $30 brand new.
Well,
so for the price of 10 copy for 1/10 of an Amazing Spider-Man number 800, you can get a Patreon subscription.
Yeah, so please come check us out there on our Patreon feed. I really think the value is worth it. And speaking of which, if for $10 a month, that's the upgraded tier, you'll get all that stuff, but you also get exclusive commissioned artwork in the mail every 6 months. And since we're at the 6-month mark, I've been told that our artwork is nearing completion from Ron Friends. So I'm hoping to have all of that artwork sent out to all of our Patreon members at that price point in the new year. Thanks for your patience, but that artwork is on its way. Don't you worry. I'm just as excited as you are to see what it looks like when it's done.
Sweet. So anyway, keep your eyes on this feed over the next few months because you'll never know what might pop up. We'll definitely be releasing an episode soon with all the details about our next season and when you should expect it to start. We hope you enjoyed this first season and tell all your friends about it as we get ready to dive into our next spectacular season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. Dan, where can we find you on the social medias?
Yeah, during the break, I'm always on Twitter. You can find me at @SupSpiderTalk, where I discuss all of my Spider-Man writings and thinkings and complainings. I feel like I'm turning into a grouchy old man, and I'm gaining a reputation, at least on the Ultimate Spin, I am, which is another place you can find me, on the Ultimate Spin podcast, discussing Miles Morales and Spider-Gwen and Spider-Men 2, that crazy series. And I also write on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. I just put a review up for Venom Inc. Alpha, where I also acted like a grouchy old man. Mark, what about you? Where can people find you on the internet in the interim?
Well, I mean, if you're a grouchy old man, what does that make me? Like the grouchiest old man or what? I mean,
it's entirely possible.
I mean, come on. I mean, have you met me? Yeah, of course, you can check me out on Chasing ASM blog, where I am talking about comics and complaining about my fantasy football team and politics and everything else. So it's just the greatest Twitter feed in the world. You can find me on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. Thank you, Dan, for taking over on the Carnage, or excuse me, Venom story. It felt like Carnage. Speaking of grouchy.
Shots fired.
I know, right? But I will hopefully be resuming on the next issue of Amazing Spider-Man for that. And then, of course, my book. It makes a great Christmas present. 100 Things Spider-Man fans should know and do before they die. Get it for all your friends. Amazon has been selling it for nothing on the Kindle edition. I almost kind of loathe luring people there because then I don't get the royalties that I should be getting for it. But God damn it, Amazon is just giving it away. So, but get the hard copy. Get the hard copy and let me know, and I can send you a book plate signatured. Okay.
So what we're saying is we're updating our Christmas tunes to 2 Turtle Doves and Mark's book Under the Tree.
Nice.
There we go. All right. So, Mark, if we cracked open your book next to the fire while drinking eggnog, I'm sure one of the 100 chapters of your book would enlighten us with some of the most touching mantras to come out of the Spider-Man books, as established by Lee and Ditko. What one would you start with if you had to start with one?
I would say, well, first of all, make sure there's some bourbon in that eggnog, and of course, with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.